The silence after the goodbye the night was quiet, yet inside Keanu Reeves, a storm was raging. His house was filled with soft music and dim light, but the emptiness in his chest made even the calm feel heavy. Sandra Bullock had left earlier that evening. No harsh words, no shouting, just silence and a look that said everything neither of them had the courage to speak. They had always been close, too close, perhaps, for two people who tried so hard to protect each other's hearts. Years of friendship had turned into something deeper, something unspoken. They both knew it, but neither dared to name it. After her last movie wrapped, Sandra decided she needed space. Hollywood had always watched their every move, twisting their smiles into stories, turning friendship into gossip. She couldn't take it anymore, and Keanu didn't stop her. He respected her choice, even if it tore him apart inside. As he sat by the window watching the city lights flicker, Keanu's phone buzzed. It was a message from her. "Thank you for always being kind, even when it hurt." He read it 3 times, then placed the phone down. No reply. Not because he didn't want to, but because sometimes silence says what words cannot. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Keanu went to work, smiled for cameras, signed autographs, but each time he saw a flash of light, he remembered the way Sandra used to laugh at his dislike for photos. His friends noticed his quietness, but he brushed it off, saying he was just tired. Truth was, he missed her, not as an actress, not as a co-star, but as the only person who saw the man behind the fame. One evening, as rain poured outside, Keanu found himself scrolling through old photos on his laptop. There they were, laughing during the Lake House press tour, teasing each other on speed, sharing quiet meals in between takes. Every picture felt like a frozen heartbeat. But what he didn't know was that Sandra, sitting miles away in her kitchen, was doing the same thing. She too couldn't let go of the quiet comfort he brought into her life. She had told herself leaving would bring clarity, but it only brought loneliness. She began writing in her journal, trying to make sense of her emotions. Every page had his name hidden between lines of regret and gratitude. Meanwhile, Keanu started visiting an old bookstore near his apartment, a place that reminded him of simplicity. No paparazzi, no noise. The owner, an elderly woman named Martha, noticed his silence. One evening, she said softly, "Some people leave not because they want to, but because they hope distance will protect something fragile." Keanu looked up, surprised by her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe Sandra had left not to end things, but to save what was left of their quiet bond. Weeks passed. Hollywood moved on, but their story lingered in whispers and interviews. Whenever someone mentioned her name, Keanu's eyes softened for a second. Whenever someone asked Sandra about him, she smiled but avoided details. They were two souls walking parallel roads, still feeling the echo of a connection they never truly ended. Then one evening, Keanu received a letter, not an email, not a text, but a handwritten note. The envelope was simple, his name written in Sandra's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter said, "You once told me love isn't about holding on, it's about wishing the other piece. I hope you found yours, because I'm still trying to find mine." For the first time in months, Keanu cried, not out of pain, but out of recognition. Her words were not goodbye, they were a confession wrapped in kindness. He folded the letter gently and placed it inside his favorite book. He whispered to the empty room, "You don't need to find peace, Sandra. You already gave it to me." Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights seemed warmer somehow. And though neither of them knew it yet, that letter was only the beginning of something that would test their hearts in ways they never imagined. The echoes of what once was the morning after reading Sandra's letter, Keanu sat by the window, watching the sunlight spill across his living room floor. He hadn't slept much, but for the first time in a long while, his heart didn't feel completely empty. Her words still echoed inside him, soft and honest. They weren't the kind of words that closed doors, they were the kind that quietly opened old ones. Days passed slowly. Keanu continued his work on a new independent film, one that spoke about loss and second chances. It was strange, almost haunting, how the script mirrored his own feelings. The director often praised his performance for being so real, not knowing that every line Keanu spoke came from a place of truth. Each take felt like therapy, each scene like a confession. The pain on screen wasn't acting. It was him remembering her laugh, her way of listening, her ability to make silence feel like comfort instead of loneliness. One evening, after a long shoot, he returned to the bookstore. Martha, the old owner, smiled when she saw him. "You look lighter today," she said, handing him a cup of tea. Keanu smiled faintly and replied, "Someone reminded me that peace isn't found by forgetting, but by remembering kindly." Martha nodded knowingly as if she understood. Across the country, Sandra was dealing with her own quiet storm. Fame had always been heavy for her. She had the smile, the charm, the grace everyone loved, but behind it all she carried exhaustion. The constant attention, the expectations, the stories that painted her life in colors that weren't hers. And beneath that, the lingering thought of Keanu, his calm presence, his rare honesty, his habit of listening without judgment. One night, after a charity gala, Sandra found herself walking alone through the city streets. Her heels clicked against the pavement, but the sound of her thoughts was louder. She passed a small park where she and Keanu once sat after an award show, sharing fries and laughing about how unreal their lives had become. She sat on that same bench, and for a moment, it felt like he was still there beside her. She took out her phone, typed a message, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. She wanted to reach out but feared what it might mean. She had seen too many friendships fade after blurred lines. She whispered to herself, maybe it's better this way, even though her heart disagreed. Weeks turned into months, and Hollywood buzzed again, rumors of a new movie starring both Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. At first, neither of them knew. It was a coincidence or maybe fate's quiet trick. The producers had sent scripts to both of them, unaware of their recent silence. Keanu hesitated before reading his copy. As his eyes moved over the lines, he realized the story was about two people who reunite years after drifting apart. His throat tightened. It was too close, too real. Sandra received the same script days later. When she saw Keanu's name on the casting list, she froze. Her assistant noticed the change in her expression. "Should I tell them you're not interested?" the assistant asked gently. Sandra shook her head slowly. "No, tell them I'll think about it." For nights, both of them wrestled with the same question. Should they step back into each other's world, even if it reopened old wounds? Keanu sat by the piano one evening playing soft notes. Music had always been his escape. The melody he played was one he had once written for Sandra during the lake house days. His hands trembled as he finished. Something inside him whispered, maybe this is the chance to heal, not to hurt. Meanwhile, Sandra reread the script for the 5th time. The story wasn't about romance. It was about forgiveness, about understanding that love isn't always about staying. It's about being kind enough to let go, yet strong enough to return when the time feels right. The next morning, both of them, miles apart, sent the same message to their agents: "I'll do it." And just like that, fate began to weave their paths together again, quiet but certain. Neither of them knew how it would feel to see each other after all this time. They didn't know if it would be closure or chaos, but somewhere deep down, both hoped it would be peace. As shooting day drew near, the tension grew. Sandra found herself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual, wondering if he would still see her the same way. Keanu, on the other hand, sat in silence, rehearsing lines that felt less like dialogue and more like the words he never got to say. The day of their first scene arrived. It was a small cafe setup, simple, intimate. She was already seated when he walked in. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. The crew around them faded into the background. Keanu smiled gently, unsure if he should say something. Sandra smiled back, her eyes glistening just a little. The director called action, but the truth was, their story had already begun again long before the camera rolled. Between the lines, they never said the first day of filming felt like walking on thin glass. Everything looked calm from the outside: lights, cameras, gentle voices. But underneath, both Keanu and Sandra carried a trembling energy they tried hard to hide. Their scene was simple: two old friends meeting after years apart, talking over coffee. Yet as the director called action, something real slipped through. Keanu looked at her across the small cafe table. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her eyes softened before every smile, it was all too familiar. The lines written in the script were meant to be fiction, but when Sandra said, "You disappeared without a word," her voice shook just slightly. She wasn't just acting, she was remembering. Keanu's throat tightened. The next line on the page read, "Some silences are kinder than words." He delivered it softly, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he had wanted to tell her in those months apart. When the director finally said, "Cut," the silence between them lingered longer than it should have. During lunch, Sandra sat in her trailer, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was perfect, her posture composed, but her heart felt anything but calm. Keanu had barely spoken outside the scene, and yet every glance from him carried an unspoken tenderness that unsettled her. She sipped her tea, trying to steady her breathing. A gentle knock on the door broke her thoughts. It was Keanu. He stood there holding a small paper bag. "I brought you something," he said, voice quiet. She blinked in surprise as he handed it to her. Inside was a chocolate muffin, the same kind they used to share on set years ago. "They had these at the cafe," he said with a shy smile. She smiled back, warmth flickering in her chest. "You remembered." "I remember a lot of things," he replied softly. For a moment it felt like the years had melted away. They sat together in silence, sharing the muffin just like before. No cameras, no audience, just two people finding comfort in something simple. Later that week, the film crew moved to a seaside location for the next set of scenes. The air was crisp, the waves gentle, and the sunsets painted the sky in shades of gold. Keanu loved the quiet of it all, but Sandra seemed distant, lost in thought. One evening, after filming wrapped early, he saw her sitting alone on the beach, her shoes off, the tide brushing against her feet. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat beside her. "Do you ever wonder," she said without looking at him, "why people who care about each other still end up apart?" He didn't answer right away. The sound of the waves filled the silence between them. "Maybe because caring doesn't always mean staying," he finally said. "Sometimes it means giving space even when it hurts." She nodded slowly. "That's what I told myself too. But space didn't make it easier, it just made the quiet louder." Keanu looked at her, his heart aching at the honesty in her voice. "I missed you," he said, barely above a whisper. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Then why didn't you say something?" "Because," he sighed, "you looked like you needed peace, and I didn't want to be the noise." Her lips trembled slightly, and for a moment she couldn't speak. It was as if years of unspoken feelings had finally found their voice, but neither of them knew what to do with it. They sat there until the sun disappeared, leaving only the sound of the sea and their shared silence. When Sandra finally stood up, she said softly, "Maybe some stories don't need an ending. Maybe they just need to be felt." The next morning, they arrived on set as if nothing had happened. But the energy between them had changed, gentler, closer, filled with understanding. Even the director noticed it. Every scene they filmed after that carried a quiet authenticity, a sense of truth that made everyone watching go still. During a break, the cinematographer whispered to a crew member, "They don't even need a script. They're just living it." What no one knew was that off-camera, Keanu had started writing again. Late at night, in his notebook, he wrote small letters he never sent. Lines about kindness, about forgiveness, about how sometimes the heart speaks best when it chooses silence. And far away in her hotel room, Sandra was doing the same, writing in her journal about how strength isn't about pretending to move on, but learning how to carry love differently. Two people writing in separate rooms, yet somehow finishing each other's sentences without knowing it. Fate had brought them back to the same movie, but life was quietly scripting something much deeper, an unfinished conversation that neither of them had realized they still needed to have. When silence turned into truth, the film had now reached its halfway mark. But for Keanu and Sandra, it felt like something else entirely was being filmed. Something more personal, something raw. Each scene seemed to pull pieces of their real story into the script, as if fate itself was the unseen director. Every shared glance, every pause, every trembling smile blurred the line between fiction and truth. On the surface, they were professionals, two seasoned actors doing their jobs, but beneath the calm rhythm of the cameras, emotions ran deeper. Sometimes, when the director called cut, neither of them moved. It was as though the words they spoke on screen were too close to their hearts to let go of right away. One evening, after a particularly emotional scene, Sandra excused herself early. She had just filmed a moment where her character confesses how hard it is to stop missing someone who was never really gone. Her voice had cracked halfway through the line, and everyone assumed it was perfect acting. It wasn't. She returned to her hotel room, locked the door, and sat on the floor. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the space, but her mind replayed Keanu's face from that scene, the gentle look in his eyes, the pause before his reply. She whispered to herself, "He meant that, didn't he?" Then she wiped her tears quickly, almost ashamed of how deeply she still cared. Meanwhile, Keanu was walking through the empty beach streets near the set. The world was asleep, and only the ocean kept him company. He carried his small notebook, the one filled with unsent letters. Tonight, he finally opened to a blank page and began writing not for himself, but for her. "Dear Sandra, I don't know what we are anymore. I don't know what we ever were. But what I do know is that you taught me what peace feels like. Maybe love doesn't have to be loud or lasting, it just has to be kind." He closed the notebook, unsure if he'd ever give it to her. But just writing it made him feel lighter, as though the words had been waiting for this night to be released. The next day, the team prepared for one of the most important scenes in the film, a reunion moment between their characters where both finally speak the truth. Everyone could feel the weight of it. The set was quiet, the lights dim, and the director gave them full freedom to improvise if they wanted. As the cameras rolled, Sandra looked at Keanu and said softly, "I kept trying to forget you, but even silence remembered your name." The line wasn't in the script. The crew froze. Keanu took a deep breath. Then maybe forgetting isn't the answer. Maybe remembering differently is. His eyes never left hers. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't break character. The air between them felt thick with years of emotion, of words they never said, of choices they couldn't undo. When the director finally whispered, "Cut," no one moved. Keanu stood up slowly and left the room without a word. Sandra stayed, sitting in the same chair, staring at the empty space where he had been standing. The director didn't ask for a retake. He quietly said, "That was real." Later that night, Sandra found herself knocking on Keanu's hotel door. He opened it, looking calm but tired. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to leave like that," she said quietly. He looked down. "I was afraid I'd say something I can't take back." "Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen," she whispered. He sighed, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "You want to know the truth?" She nodded. "When you left," he said, his voice low, "I told myself you were right, that distance would help, but all it did was make me realize how much space you already filled." Her eyes softened, tears welling again. "I thought I was protecting us, protecting you." "From what?" he asked gently. "From the noise, the pressure, the way the world turns every friendship into a headline." She looked away, then added, "I didn't want our kindness to be misunderstood." Keanu stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper. "You can't protect something by running from it, Sandra." She looked up, and for a moment they just stood there, two people who had spent years hiding behind politeness, finally seeing each other as they truly were. Scared, caring, imperfect, human, a single tear slipped down her face. "I missed you," she said softly. Keanu hesitated, then reached out, gently brushing the tear away with his thumb. "I know," he replied, voice trembling. "Me too." They didn't hug, they didn't kiss. They simply stood there, breathing the same air, the silence between them finally feeling safe instead of empty. When she left his room that night, neither of them said goodbye. They didn't need to. The truth had finally been spoken, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. But what neither of them realized was that the hardest part wasn't over yet. The film's final scene was still ahead, the one that would mirror the ending of their real story. And it would force them to face one last question neither had dared to answer. What if love never really ends? It just changes its shape. Where hearts begin to heal, the final days of filming arrived with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The movie had taken everything out of them. Emotion, patience, and memories they thought they had buried long ago. The director called it their most authentic work, but neither Keanu nor Sandra cared about reviews anymore. For them, the story had become personal, a reflection of everything they had lost and were slowly rediscovering. On the last morning of the shoot, the sun rose over the ocean, casting a soft golden light on the quiet set. The final scene was scheduled to be filmed at dawn, a farewell moment between their characters. Everyone on the crew felt the emotion in the air. Even the wind seemed to move more gently, as if nature itself wanted to witness their goodbye. Sandra sat in the makeup chair, staring into the mirror. She had barely slept. Her reflection showed a calm face, but her heart raced. Today wasn't just the end of a film. It was the end of a chapter she wasn't sure she was ready to close. She looked at her reflection and whispered, "Don't cry on camera." In another trailer, Keanu sat quietly, flipping through his notebook. It was now filled with small thoughts, reflections, and a few letters he had written but never sent. He turned to the page he wrote the night she had knocked on his door. He read it again and smiled softly. Some stories are not meant to be finished. They're meant to be remembered. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the crew members letting him know it was time. Keanu nodded, took a deep breath, and placed the notebook inside his jacket pocket before heading out. The set was simple, a pier stretching into the sea, waves gently brushing against the wood. Sandra stood at the edge, her back to him. The director explained the scene. They would walk toward each other, exchange a few lines, then part ways, just like the story demanded. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't just acting anymore. "Ready?" the director asked. Keanu nodded. "Ready? Action." He walked slowly toward her. She turned around, their eyes meeting under the soft light of dawn. The lines were written, but something in the air told them to speak from the heart instead. "You look peaceful," Keanu said softly. Sandra smiled faintly. Maybe because for once I'm not pretending. Neither am I. They stood there for a long pause, the ocean wind brushing through their hair, carrying unspoken memories between them. She finally said, "You ever think about what could have been?" "Every day," he replied, voice steady but heavy. "And does it still hurt?" "Not the way it used to," he said. "It's like a scar that reminds you something beautiful once existed." She nodded, tears slowly filling her eyes. "Then maybe that's what we are now, something beautiful that doesn't need to hurt anymore." Keanu smiled gently, and without warning, he reached into his jacket and handed her the notebook. She looked at it, surprised. "What's this?" "My side of the story," he said quietly. "You don't have to read it now, maybe one day when the world feels too loud." She hesitated, holding the notebook close to her chest. "And what if it makes me miss you more?" "Then it means it worked," he replied softly. For a moment, the silence between them carried everything words couldn't. The director whispered, "Cut," but neither of them moved. The cameras stopped rolling, the crew went quiet, yet they stayed standing there, two souls learning that closure doesn't always come with an ending. After the final wrap, everyone celebrated. Laughter filled the set, people took photos, shared hugs, and toasted the success of the film. Sandra smiled, but her eyes kept drifting toward Keanu. He stood near the pier railing, looking out at the sea, a faint smile on his face. When the crowd thinned, she walked up beside him. "So," she said gently, "this is goodbye again?" He shook his head slightly. "No, I don't think it ever was." They both smiled, the kind of smile that comes after pain has softened into peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sandra opened the notebook for the first time. Inside, she found letters, not love letters, but reflections. Words about kindness, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of letting go. Every page carried a piece of him, not as a lover or a co-star, but as a soul that had walked beside hers through both light and shadow. The last page had only one line written on it. "You taught me that love doesn't always end, it just changes how it shows itself." Her eyes blurred with tears, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. In that moment, she realized something powerful. She didn't need to hold on to what they used to be. She only needed to carry the lessons they left each other with. Keanu turned to her, noticing the tears. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, smiling through them. "Better than I've been in years." They walked together in silence, their steps slow and easy. No promises, no regrets, just peace. And as they reached the end of the pier, she looked at him and said softly, "Thank you, Keanu." He smiled. "For what?" "For never making love feel like a cage." He looked away toward the sea, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for reminding me that love can still be gentle." The evening breeze carried their words into the horizon. Two people, once broken by distance, now healed by understanding. The peace after the storm. Months had passed since the film wrapped, but its echoes still lingered in both their lives. Critics called it a masterpiece of emotion, praising their unmatched chemistry and raw vulnerability. Yet, for Keanu and Sandra, it was much more than that. It wasn't just a movie, it was a mirror. A final chapter of something that had begun years ago and quietly evolved into a deeper, calmer bond. Keanu had returned to his simple life, away from the noise of premieres and interviews. His home was still the same, quiet, filled with books, soft music, and the faint hum of peace. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his guitar, he found himself thinking about her again, not with pain, but with warmth. The kind of warmth that comes when memories no longer hurt, but instead make you grateful. He had learned something precious. Not all love stories are meant to end with grand gestures or forever promises. Some are meant to teach us how to love better, how to be kind even when it hurts, and how to let go without bitterness. Meanwhile, Sandra had been traveling, helping with charity projects, visiting children's hospitals, and taking a step away from the camera. Everywhere she went, she carried Keanu's notebook with her. Sometimes at night, she would open a random page and read his words again. They didn't make her cry anymore. They made her feel understood. One evening, while volunteering at a children's art event, a small girl handed her a drawing. It showed two people standing under the same sky, holding hands but facing different directions. The girl smiled shyly and said, "They're still together even if they walk apart." Sandra froze for a moment, her heart tightening with recognition. She smiled back, gently touching the drawing. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Later that night, she sat by the window of her hotel room and looked at the stars. Without overthinking, she picked up her phone and sent a message to Keanu. "I finally understand what you meant when you said love can change how it shows itself. Thank you for teaching me that." Keanu was on his balcony when the message arrived. The night air was cool and the city lights shimmered below. He read her words twice, then smiled. No reply was needed. She had understood, and that was enough. Weeks later, fate brought them together again, this time at a charity gala in Los Angeles. They hadn't planned to see each other. Sandra was speaking for a children's foundation, and Keanu was there as a quiet donor. When she walked onto the stage, he stood in the crowd, unseen, listening to her words. She spoke not about fame or success, but about kindness, about how small acts of care can change lives. "We all carry stories that never made the news," she said softly, "but kindness doesn't need headlines, it just needs a heart willing to listen." As the room applauded, her eyes drifted through the crowd, and then stopped. For a brief second, she met his gaze. Time didn't freeze, but it softened. They both smiled, quietly, knowingly. After the event, she found him near the exit, standing alone, holding a cup of coffee just like he always did. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said with a gentle smile. "I didn't want to take attention away from you," he replied. "You never do," she whispered. They stepped outside, where the night air was still and peaceful. Cars passed by, cameras flashed at a distance, but in that small bubble of calm it was just them, two old souls no longer defined by the past. "So," Sandra said softly, "this is what peace feels like." Keanu nodded. "Yeah. And it's not lonely anymore, is it?" "No," she said, smiling faintly. "It's full." They walked for a while, talking about ordinary things, friends, books, travel, life. No heavy emotions, no what-ifs. Just two people who had loved, lost, learned, and still cared deeply in their own quiet way. As they reached the corner, Sandra turned to him. "You know, I still keep your notebook," she said. Keanu smiled. "Good. I was afraid you'd throw it away." "Never," she replied softly. "It reminds me that sometimes love doesn't end, it just finds a different home." He looked at her, eyes calm and warm. "And maybe," he said, "we were always meant to be that kind of story." She nodded slowly, the streetlights painting soft gold on her face. "A story without endings," she whispered. They shared one last smile, one that carried years of understanding. No regrets, no pain, just gratitude. Then they parted ways, not with sadness, but with peace. Later that night, Sandra opened her journal and wrote her final entry about him. "We never needed to be together to stay connected. Some souls just recognize each other and never forget." At the same time, Keanu looked up at the night sky and whispered, "Thank you, Sandra, for reminding me that love can stay gentle." The wind carried his words into the quiet, as if the universe itself was listening. Somewhere between their separate lives, something beautiful remained, unspoken, eternal, and kind.